This podcast is sponsored by Brazos Press. Brazos Press publishes books that creatively draw upon the riches of the Christian story to deepen our understanding of God's world and inspire faithful reflection and engagement. A Brazos Press book that I recommend is How to Inhabit Time: Understanding the Past, Facing the Future, Living Faithfully Now by James K. A. Smith. This book was named a Christianity Today Award finalist, and in the book, Smith helps Christians and the church develop a sense of temporal awareness that is attuned to the texture of history, the vicissitudes of life, and the tempo of the Spirit. Smith shows that awakening to spiritual significance of time is crucial for orienting faith in the 21st century. Get 30% off and free shipping at bakerbookhouse.com. Welcome, all of my listeners, to another episode of The Scandal of Reading. I'm really delighted that I get to do this. I find such joy in getting to have conversations with people that I respect and admire. And today, especially, I'm getting to know Patti Callahan Henry, who is the author of Becoming Mrs. Lewis. I'll let her talk a little bit about herself in a second. And I invited her on today to get to talk about Til We Have Faces, because we both love C.S. Lewis's novel, The Myth Retold, and we will get to unpack that novel today. So Patti, thanks for joining us. Do you mind introducing yourself to everybody?
Hi, Jessica. I am so happy to be here with you. For those of you out there, we met at a C.S. Lewis conference and immediately we're like, blah, 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 blah. So if I could just talk to you every day, I'm sure I would have a much brighter outlook on the world. You are such a bright light, my friend. So I am Patti Callahan Henry. I am a novelist. And I wrote contemporary novels until about 6 years ago, when I became fascinated with Joy Davidman, who is C.S. For those of you who don't know, she is the very incredibly complicated and definitely improbable wife of C.S. Lewis. And so that set me off on historical fiction, kind of pivoted in my career. So right now I write historical fiction, and that is who I am.
I didn't realize that was the impetus for you writing this. I kind of assumed, because I haven't known you very long, that this was just your genre. Like, you do historical fiction.
No.
Wow.
So my first 9 novels are contemporary. And before I was a novelist, I was a nurse. So there have been a couple pivots along the way, as in your life. And that pivot, when it happened, it was such a fascinating kind of moment for me, because I was older. I'd been writing novels for 10 or 15 years. And to say I'm completely changing genres felt not terrifying, but, a little wobbly when you're doing all right in the area that you are in. But Joy Davidman was irresistible. And so I couldn't ignore her. She would not leave me alone. And I know that sounds strange, but so I wrote this novel, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, in secret for a couple years.
Wow.
While I did my research.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So I find this genre really interesting. I read Hemingway's Wife, and then there was
The Paris Wife?
Yes, I read The Paris Wife. That's what it was, about Hemingway's wife.
Yeah, that's my friend Paula McLain.
Oh, you know Paula. Okay. That was amazing. So what was it about Joy Davidman? What was it? I mean, I know we're going to talk about C.S. Lewis, but I just have to know, like, what drew you to her as a subject?
Well, when I first thought about writing about it, I thought, I want to write this love story, very much like The Paris Wife, like this kind of doomed, except in this case, redemptive love story. Hemingway and his first wife, Hadley, that was not a redeemed love story. Right. That was just flat out tragic. And so I was like, I want to write this really amazing love story. And I knew a lot about Lewis. I'm a preacher's kid. I've been reading Lewis since I was a child, but I didn't know that much about Joy. So I, like most people, believed that the only thing I'd seen, which was Shadowlands. And that she was this American woman who just showed up in England, and Lewis fell in love with her, and she had one kid, and they got married. So I thought, I want to tell that story from her point of view, because if you watch Shadowlands, she's dying the whole movie, right? And it's completely told from Lewis's kind of world perspective and how it affected his faith and his work. And I wanted it from her point of view. Well, then I started researching her, And I was like, are you kidding me? This is not just a love story. This is one of the most fascinating, complicated women I have met on paper. And she, born and raised in New York, genius, Mensa genius. She could read when she was 3 years old. She could play Chopin by ear. She won the Yale Younger Poets Award. She graduated from college when she was 16, I think,
Wow.
15. She graduated from graduate school and did her thesis when she was 18 from Columbia. She was a flat out genius. And she was an atheist. And she was a communist for a little while. And she was married with 2 kids in New York.
Yeah.
So here we have this complicated woman who has never left New York for her whole life, except for 6 months when she wrote screenplays in Hollywood. And then we have our beloved C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, who had never left England or Ireland, except for the 6 months he fought in the war in France. And so here we have these 2 people. How did they possibly come together to change not only C.S. Lewis's life, but the last decade of his work? Yeah. And that's when I took off running with the novel that was much more than a love story and was also a story about, which is what Til We Have Faces is about.
Yes.
Finding your true self.
Yeah. I definitely want to read passages from that because I found that beautiful how
Thank you.
Your writing about their relationship actually elucidated Til We Have Faces for me. Like, I know it's fictionalized, but just getting to have the story behind the story was really lovely. So I can't wait to ask you, like, how much of that is true or not true.
Yeah. And one of the things that had never been talked about before, because it hadn't been found until about, I think, 6 years before I started the novel, was a lost box of love sonnets that Joy Davidman wrote to C.S. Lewis. So about 6 years before I started writing the novel, a box was found in an old family friend's house. Her son was helping an old family friend clean out this house and found a box of 300 unpublished poems, short stories, letters, documents. But among them were the 45 love sonnets to C.S. Lewis. So it highlighted and spurred a different kind of story than we might have had if those love sonnets hadn't been found. And like you said, they feed in to Til We Have Faces.
Oh, okay. So her sonnets, was she writing them when they got married? Was she writing them before? Was it like a pining away at Lewis, the way you kind of depict her pining?
That's a great question. So she compiles them for him, 45 love sonnets for C.S. Lewis, and she writes a letter to him. So they were all in one folder, and on the folder was the word courage. There is some debate, not for me or for Don W. King, who is an expert on her poetry, about whether she ever showed it to him.
Okay.
But she did. And because there's a letter to him at the front that says, Dear Jack, here are some, and it's a funny little ditty that she wrote. But what she did is many of them were written during their relationship before, and here's the interesting part, before she quit writing them when she started writing Til We Have Faces with him.
Oh.
So those love sonnets and all the pining and the angst and will you ever love me back and must I begin again, all of this like angsty vulnerability and neediness and desperation for him to move past philia, friendship, and love her, all of that ended with Til We Have Faces.
Oh, wow.
She quit writing them. But some of the sonnets, so they're all sonnets, which is a very strict poetry form, for those who don't know. All of the sonnets, not all of them she wrote after she met him. There's a few mixed in there that she had written as a younger woman, but she mixed them into this kind of narrative arc about falling in love.
Wow. That is amazing. So who is Lewis at this point? So she comes over, we know she's going through the divorce, and you set all of that up in your novel. And who is he before he writes Til We Have Faces? Like, at what point in his career and life are we looking at?
So we're spanning their relationship spans a decade. If we're going to talk up until he started Til We Have Faces, that was in March of 55. She shows up in England in 1952 for the first time and moves there in 1953.
Okay.
So they start corresponding in 1950. And then she comes to visit in late 52, August of 52, and moves there in September of 53. So I'm going to kind of set the stage for Till We Have Faces. So at this point in 1954, C.S. Lewis has left Oxford to become a professor at Cambridge. And interestingly, both colleges have the same name; they're just pronounced differently. So he was a tutor at Magdalen College in Oxford when they met, and he took a job as a professor at Magdalen College in Cambridge. And he was constantly going back and forth because he always lived at the Kilns. He had rooms at Cambridge, but he is going back and forth. So at this point, Joy lives in London. She has moved there permanently, and she is constantly writing letters back and forth to her husband, Bill. Her boys are in school, and they are 10 and 8 kind of age. But she often, when he comes back, she often spends time with him in Oxford and stays at the Kilns. At this point, she is divorced. So now we're in March of 1955. And Lewis comes home for probably a spring break. That's what we would call it. And she stays with him at the Kilns. And she writes a letter. The reason we know how it started is she wrote a letter to her ex-husband and essentially said, poor Jack, he has dried up. So he has more time on his hands than he did at Oxford, but he feels like he's out of story ideas because Till We Have Faces is Lewis's last work of fiction. It's the last work of fiction he wrote. And she kind of said something to the effect of, the poor dear has dried up. And so we sat around, drank a whiskey, and started kicking around some ideas.
Wow.
Her exact words are, here, I'll read them. One night, Jack was lamenting he couldn't get a good idea for a book. We kicked a few ideas around until one came to life. Then we had another whiskey, and we bounced it back and forth between us. The next day, without further planning, he wrote the first chapter. I read it, and I made some criticisms. So she's obviously living in another bedroom, but that is where they start working together on this novel. So that's kind of the stage setup.
Yeah. And I loved reading that section. I mean, the whole beginning section of her life was all completely new to me. But then reading.
And most people.
Yes.
Jessica, most people, I mean, all they know is Deborah Winger, right?
Right. Yes. They don't know her conversion story, which is fascinating. And just
so fascinating.
Her courage through her marriage and its end. And but when you get to that episode where you're actually writing this out, which is just so cool to get to hear the letters that inspired you to do this. But basically she's encouraging him to go back to an idea that he said that he had, right? He said, I could write another allegory like Screwtape or Pilgrim or another children's books, but those seem to have run their course. And she says, what myth do you think of the most when you think of myth at all? And he said, Cupid and Psyche. Right. But she gave up on it. Yeah. So she encourages him to return to this. Why does she encourage him to return to this? I mean, does she have any stake in this narrative, the Cupid and Psyche myth?
Oh, of course. Okay. So there's a couple of things to know that Lewis tried to approach this myth from different avenues throughout his life. He tried a poetry sequence. He tried, I think, a children's, but he had approached this myth in different ways through his whole life. And she encouraged him to just do what he did, which is a myth retold. Now, the other backstory to know is both of them were completely educated in and completely fascinated by mythology. So they were both very, what's the word I'm looking for? But they were both very knowledgeable and could talk about and did talk about all the time the power of myth. And if you know anything about Lewis's conversion story, he actually said, I finally realized that Christ is the true myth. And so for him, myth, and for her, mythology was always something they talked about, something they dove into. So this was a natural project that they could combine their knowledge, but also the hidden parts of what was going on between them. Andrew Lazo is a real expert in this, and he says that so much of their hidden love, just like Oriole's hidden love for Bardia, is hidden in between the lines. So not only are they taking all their knowledge of mythology, all their love of mythology, but something is happening between them that is neither one of them can put into words. Joy had tried to put it into sonnets, and Lewis, of course, was cut off from it at the time. But here it goes into a fiction story about mythical love and God and the gods and the bigger questions. So yes, that is why this was the right time for what Lewis calls far and away my best novel.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned that she helped him write that, which is something I didn't know until you and I met. But when the two of them are talking and she starts asking him about this, because she starts wondering, like, did you see me as Oriole, the ugly one, in love with Bardia, who will never return her love? And he wants to title it Bareface, right?
Yes.
And she of course doesn't seem to think that that's a title. And at one point you said, like, in her thoughts, she's saying, take me in your arms and set me down on that bed and make love to me. And I thought, that would be so hard for me to write, like, about C.S. Lewis.
I know, it was so hard for me to write. But if you read her poetry, she's way more explicit than that. So that is a toned down kind of emotional truth from Joy Davidman that sounds like crazy to talk about C.S. Lewis that way. But if you read her poetry, it's toned down.
Wow. Yeah. And she says that she sees more than a glimpse of herself in the story. And she wants to ask Jack, is this creation of me? And they talk about, like, how Oriole eventually came to self-knowledge, self-love. These are your words. Love for the gods and reunion with Psyche. Much destruction had been wrought along the way. And as they're talking about this is probably my favorite line that you write here in this episode, at least, is she touches his arm and says, Jack, as it's always been, we use stories to make sense of the world.
Oh, isn't it so true, though?
I love that.
I don't know if she ever said that because, of course, there's not a stenographer following around their every conversation. But it sounds like something she would say, and I know it's something they both believed, and it's something I believe and something you believe, right?
Yeah.
That's what story is. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you see that with Til We Have Faces? Like, how is that story helping make sense of something in the world? What is the mystery you see there that, like, Lewis and Joy were trying to explicate or highlight?
Part of it is the four loves. All four loves are built into that novel. They were both in philia, in friendship at the moment.
Yeah. Do you mind defining, just in case people aren't C.S. Lewis aficionados, what the four loves are?
Okay, you're going to have to help me. So we have Eros, which is romantic love. Philia, which is friendship love. Agape, or I've heard it pronounced different ways, but that's love with the divine. And what am I missing?
The piety, the love of neighbor and friend, but I can't, not friend.
Yes.
Neighbor, like.
Yes. Neighbor, goodwill. Right.
I can't remember exactly what it's called.
We'll put it in the show notes. In the novel, they work through all four of those. And it's the first novel, as they're working through this, these subconscious things in their relationship, that it's the first time Lewis wrote about women from the mouth of a woman with a woman.
Yeah.
So, and it's the last fiction book he wrote, like I said. So there's this shift in him of narrative drive, of point of view, of collaboration. And, we both know Diana Glyer is an expert on collaboration and the Inklings and so many more, but they were collaborating, and he had been collaborating with his men friends,
Mm-hmm.
from Tolkien to Charles Williams. And here he is writing about a woman from a woman's point of view with a woman.
Yeah. And I know we don't want to explore too much that hideous strength, but just briefly, I want to just
Yep.
suggest to people there's such a difference in this, which should be seen more as his final say on what the feminine is, more than his earlier work, that hideous strength, almost 15 years beforehand, in which he's writing only with men and trying to say things about women that instead are just condescending. And I think he would have revoked after knowing Joy. And then also at this time, he's really good friends with Dorothy L. Sayers.
Right.
I think those two strong women in his life made him change his view. Like, I think this is just such a complete retelling of that myth of what women are into this one.
And at the time, he was also in relationship with a lot of really strong women. Dorothy L. Sayers, his mother, Flora, was an incredibly strong woman. So it's not like Lewis didn't have women relationships, but he didn't have them romantically like Joy, this kind of iron on iron, strength on strength, wit on wit. I mean, they used to play Scrabble in every language. And when she dies in his book of Grief Observed, I mean, he says, what was she not to me? And I'm not positive who said it, but I think it was Charles Williams Owen Barfield, who said that what Lewis thought about anything was in everything he wrote. So if you look at Till We Have Faces and you have questions about what Lewis thought about women, read it.
Yeah.
Right? He answers it himself in the novel.
Well, especially with you have these two characters, Oriole and Psyche. And what's the other princess? What's her name? Something.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't fall easily into categories.
No.
Which I loved, because unlike that hideous strength where it's like Mother Dimble, right? You always have the mother figure. And then you have Hardcastle, like the hardcore feminist. You have these almost stereotypical ideas of women.
Well, you have flat, one-dimensional characters. And Until We Have Faces, nobody's one-dimensional.
I love that.
Oriole almost knows that she's lying to herself as she is bitter with the gods, right? And there's this, as much as you want to be angry at her for what she does to Psyche, you also have this, and I feel this way about Joy. Sometimes I'm angry at the choices she made, and yet you have this great tenderness for the brokenness inside that hasn't yet seen their true face in Christ. And so they act in these bitter ways, or these kind of armored ways, until they can see that they can, just like in the novel, take off their veil or their false self to see their true face in Christ. And I mean, that's essentially, there's, as with any great work of fiction, there's thousands of layers until we have faces. But the one that strikes me, not as a professional, but as a reader the most, is that idea of the true self and the true face, and being willing to take off the veil to look at the ugly parts. Because when she does that, when she takes off her veil to look at the ugly parts, she sees Unget, the goddess.
Yeah.
But she's unwilling to see that because she sees herself as ugly. So there's this, that's why he wanted to call it Bareface. And it's called Till We Have Faces. So.
Which is, it's lovely. I've heard some people talk negatively about the fact that Oriole is so ugly. And Redival is pretty, but she misuses it into ugliness because it's like the superficial beauty. Yes. But what it seems like what Lewis is doing with this idea of what is beautiful or what is ugly has so much more to do with the soul of the person.
And the bitterness, her bitterness, right?
It makes her, and yes, they do joke that she's ugly. There's this caricatureness of like how much she looks like a dog, or a really hideous man. So it's not that it's not literally, she's literally ugly, but she doesn't understand what her true face is, and therefore she can't get past the ugliness. She can't get past the material view of things, right?
Well,
And
we have to remember too, she's narrating the book, right?
yeah,
And she doesn't see clearly.
yeah.
So how ugly is she really?
You know what? I also thought that was so genius because he writes like 90% of the book from her blind perspective, because it's only
Yes.
the very last scenes that we get in which he overturns that. Right? It's not like she's writing this in hindsight, being like, I was so wrong. I misunderstood. She writes most of it being like, I'm justified. I was right. I was
Yep.
ugly. Psyche was wrong. And
Yep.
she writes it against herself, not knowing that it's against herself the whole time until the end. And the end is just this beautiful unturning, this like vision of
So
redemption.
you gave me chills. Yes. And I think Andrew says that it's a bit like Screwtape, right? This kind of reverse lie
Yes.
of who she really is. So she's lying to herself. She's lying to us.
Mm-hmm.
She's bitter. She's jealous. And she's rationalizing. And when we rationalize, we lie.
Yes.
You
yes.
know, often.
Right.
So there's just this great beauty in the removal of the false look.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And
I love that
and
you saw that too.
well, especially I was thinking about it in terms of like the book is unveiling us to ourselves. Right?
If you take the time to read it not as a quick read of a myth retold, but if you really, it's one of those books you have to read almost a few times.
Yeah.
I've read it. I've listened to it on audio. I've, listened to Andrew's podcast on it. There is never ending like onion layers to peel back.
Yeah.
And so I feel like what we see is a mirror of what we need to see because there's so much in it.
Well, one of the things that I've said often about fiction, I'm going to use it here too, is like the best books are not mirrors. The best books are icons that read us.
Exactly. I
Right?
love that. I'm so stealing that from you. Yes.
Because I think that that's what this book does. I mean, it's and that whole image of the lantern and like seeing the truth versus the blindness of the dark. And the best books do that to you. That the worst books just hold up a reflection. You see what you want to see, and that's all you see. But books like this, it holds a lantern up to you. It shows yourself in a new light. It reads you. And of all of his works, I feel like this one does that the most.
If you're willing, right? If you're willing, if you are, there's certain times we can feel a ping like, oh, I think that's me. And then they're like, no, I'm a very good person. It's not me. But if we allow it to be like, ooh, I think I do that, or I see that, or why am I carrying that bitterness, or why am I arguing with the gods? And in the end, she essentially says, I'm going to, kind of twist this because I'm not looking exactly, but, you don't have, you yourself are the questions.
Ooh.
And I love that, like I'm looking for answers that already live in you as the God. So I know. And so these things that ping us about our doubt or our bitterness or, our argument with the gods is unanswerable because it's only answered in the question.
Oh, that's so good. And that's, you have to actually know, you have to know the person that's the answer. It's not just a rational refutation. Instead it's this like,
you don't take them to court.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It can only be known through the story, through writing of the book itself. I mean, that's why she gets, to the end and it's like no answer, but then meeting face to face, knowing Christ face to face, that's the answer to the question.
Right.
Oh, so beautiful. Okay. I'm going to ask you one more Lewis question. Then I want to ask a personal question as we wrap up. So the Lewis question is, in that hideous strength, he said, this is retelling everything I wrote in Abolition of Man. Do you think Till We Have Faces is a retelling of everything of Four Loves?
Yes, partially, but only partially.
Okay.
But absolutely. I think it's I don't think it's a retelling. I think it's a revisit. And I think it's a revisit through his relationship with the woman he loves, who he doesn't know he loves yet.
Yeah, because Four Loves he wrote prior to his relationship with her, right?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay. I didn't know if it was after he had met her.
And the problem of pain.
This says 1960.
I know, but that's probably not a first edition, right?
It just gives me the first copyright is 1960.
Oh,
and
it
then
does? So then he must have been writing that.
Okay. So which
We'll
means
cut this out while I look it up.
What it means to me is that through the discovery, if this is true, I love discovering things. I tell students all the time, I'm a co-learner. It's less about being the expert and never getting things wrong than it is about learning things, because you're asking questions you don't know the answer to. So I'm asking a question I don't know the answer to in the hopes that I learned something. And I think I just did. So he was writing Till We Have Faces as a way of uncovering things he thought he knew.
Yes.
And only in the process does he understand real charity, which leads him to also be able to have eros towards Joy. And once that is fully experienced, he can write this that he probably could not have written.
Yes.
So and I think sorry, I'm like just coming to a theory, Patti. This is not my plan, but
no, you're onto something here. Let's write a book about
this. Right? Because that hideous strength, he's retelling something he already knew. And that might be why there's so much flatness to the parable of the things he already knew. But Till We Have Faces, he's in a relationship with a woman that leaves him in a place of questioning, like you said. And he's learning things he didn't know that leads to write this kind of book to unpack it after the story revealed to him these mysteries he couldn't pin down.
And in the Four Loves, he says, which makes sense, it's after, is some friendships can turn to love in the first 15 minutes and others grow slowly into love. And that is what had happened to him and Joy. And also in the Four Loves, he talks literally about eros and union. And he couldn't have written that before he was married to and with Joy Davidman.
He couldn't have, because all he knew was either Storge writing letters to these people who were away from him, and then Philia. That's all he knew before this. I love it. That's so good.
It's so beautiful.
I knew I wanted to talk to you, not only because your own book is just fascinating, but I knew that you could shed light on Till We Have Faces, which is one of my favorite books too. Last personal question, can you tell me what you're working on right now?
Oh gosh, yes, I can. Well, it's funny because usually when I write a book and it's out in the world and I tour with it or talk about it for a year or two, it doesn't go away by any means. But I'm not on the road with it or talking about it but Becoming Mrs. Lewis, it's such a fascinating, never-ending conversation. I mean, that book came out over 4 years ago. So, and we're talking about it fresh and anew all the time. But I do have a new book coming out in May of 2023. It is called The Secret Book of Flora Lee. Comes out with Simon & Schuster, and I'll give you a very quick synopsis. I believe, like you, that stories change us and shift inside of us. And I too, which is why I love Joy and Jack so much, I too am kind of a mythology fairy tale geek. In high school, instead of taking something useful like Spanish or French so I could travel, I took Latin, which is an unspeakable. We've talked about this.
I love it. Yeah.
Because your kids are taking it too.
Yes.
It's really important. But when you take Latin, you learn about, the mythology that rises up inside that language. This is a story that takes place in 1939 England during what is called Operation Pied Piper, which is when they took all the children from the big cities and they were evacuated to the country, some even to Canada and America. But we're going to focus on the ones that were sent to the country, very much like the 4 children in Narnia. That was called, they don't say that in Narnia, but that was called Operation Pied Piper, where they sent children to the country. So when I was writing a chapter in my novel, Once Upon a Wardrobe, which explores the origins of Narnia, I got really interested in Operation Pied Piper and what that meant for children. Millions of children were sent away from the cities to live with strangers. Some had incredible experiences, some had terrible experiences. My book is about two imaginary sisters named Hazel and Flora who live in Bloomsbury, London, and are sent to the countryside of Oxfordshire in Binsey, which is a tiny medieval hamlet right on the other side of the River Thames from Oxford. And the older sister, Hazel, to keep the younger sister, who's only 5 years old, calm, she makes up a fairy tale world for the two of them. They escape there at night when they tell stories. Sometimes they play in the woodlands and pretend they're in Whisperwood. That is the name of their magical land, Whisperwood. Well, a year goes by, the Blitz happens in London, and Flora Lee disappears. It is assumed that she has drowned in the River Thames, as she is only 5 years old. And Hazel believes that her baby sister, her little sister, has gone to look for Whisperwood, and she blames herself. Then we jump ahead 20 years, and Flora Lee has never been found, and Hazel works in an antiquarian bookshop in London when a fairy tale collection written by an American author comes into the store with original illustrations by a little nod to Narnia by Pauline Baynes, and the book is called Whisperwood.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. That is so cool. Yeah. Oh, I'm hooked. So
it's very much, about what we talk about. It's very much about the power of story. It's about how we use story, and it's how, maybe story can bring us back together.
Yeah. I love your imagination. It's so uplifting, and
you are so sweet.
Well, I read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of stories, and your book was just such a beautiful relief every day to get to enter that world and be with these very virtuous, heroic characters who are facing problems. I mean, there's definitely problems, but they face them in the ways that I want to face them. And so I loved getting to read that. So
thank you, my friend.
Well, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. This podcast is sponsored by Brazos Press. Brazos Press publishes books that creatively draw upon the riches of the Christian story to deepen our understanding of God's world and inspire faithful reflection and engagement. A Brazos Press book that I recommend is my latest, Reading for the Love of God, How to Read as a Spiritual Practice. In this book, I show how to read as a spiritual practice in a way that encourages humility, increases charity toward others, frees minds and hearts from the trappings of contemporary idols, and gives direction toward contemplation. Get 30% off and free shipping at bakerbookhouse.com.